Do you find yourself feeling tired on a daily basis? Do you wish you had more focus? Hi everyone. Today we're going to review a study that investigates how sleep deprivation and extension affects cognitive performance. Most of you probably know that sleep is good for you, but how much is best? The answer may surprise you, so stay tuned to find out. In the study, the researchers looked at how sleep deprivation and extension influence cognitive performance on tasks that require differing levels of cognitive demand. They also investigated the influence of emotionally distracting stimuli by displaying fearful versus neutral faces. Data was collected from 23 young adults at an average age of approximately 25 years old. Here's an example of the test they used. It's called the Emotional Interference Attention Test, or EIT. Wow, I don't know about you, but that fearful face is pretty distracting. Anyway, the task here was to push a button labeled congruent if the lines in the picture were parallel, or incongruent if the lines were not parallel. Low cognitive load was when the congruent lines were horizontal and the incongruent lines were perpendicular. And then the high cognitive load test was when the congruent lines were at 45 degrees and the incongruent lines only differed from each other by a small angle, in this case about 15 degrees. So some of you are probably thinking, this is a pretty simple test. Essentially they were just analyzing or responding if the lines were parallel or perpendicular, or if they differed by some small degree or angle. And you're right, it is a pretty simple test, but these researchers just wanted to analyze essentially if sleep extension and deprivation affected response times and accuracy and attention for these more mundane tasks, because you can kind of extrapolate performance on these simple tasks to more complex tasks. And we know that if there is a performance degradation or improvement on one of these simple tasks, then a more complex task is surely going to be affected as well. And finally, the number of correct answers and amount of time each participant took for each response was recorded. Regarding the study protocol, participants were given actigraphy watches, which are like fitness watches, which were used to measure their sleep at home for 14 nights. Then they came into the lab and were recorded with advanced sleep equipment called polysomnography for 2 nights. And during this time, they were instructed to spend 8 hours in bed trying to sleep each night. After this, they performed the first emotional attentional interference test. Then they underwent sleep extension and were instructed to spend 10 hours in bed each night for 7 nights while at the lab. After the sleep extension phase, participants underwent another emotion attentional interference test. Then they were sleep deprived for 34.5 hours before they took the final test. Finally, on day 26, participants were granted 10 hours in bed to recover from the sleep deprivation. Okay, let's take a look at the results regarding sleep. All of this was measured using polysomnography, which is the gold standard for recording sleep. At baseline, participants slept an average of 443 minutes, which is around 7.5 hours, and then they significantly increased their sleep in the sleep extension phase by sleeping an average of 536 minutes, which is about 9 hours over each of the 7 nights. Sleep duration was also significantly higher at over 9.5 hours during recovery after sleep deprivation, which is to be expected. Other metrics of sleep were also impacted from the intervention, and if you're interested, I encourage you to read the article to learn more. Okay, so here are the results we've been waiting for. After sleep extension on day 23, participants were found to score significantly higher on the high load cognitive test, but showed no improvement in the low load test. I think that's a pretty cool result. Sleep extension improved performance on the more challenging task. Imagine something you have to do that's really difficult or requires a lot of thinking. Maybe it's homework or an exam. Maybe it's something you have to do at work or at home. This study is saying that sleeping more or extending your sleep could be able to make those tasks easier. Anyway, let's move on to see how emotional interference affects cognitive performance. Remember those faces? Surprisingly, those faces had no significant effect on the accuracy of responses in the low load or high load conditions. This is seen by the lack of difference between the blue and orange bars in each condition. On the other hand, the researchers found a trend between overall accuracy on the EIT and average difference in sleep duration between extension and habitual at-home sleep. In other words, someone who increased their sleep by 2 hours compared to their baseline sleep during the sleep extension phase was likely to increase their accuracy more than someone who only increased their sleep by 1 hour. There was also an association between percent of slow wave sleep at the end of the extension phase and change in accuracy for the high load cognitive test, but not for the low load cognitive test. So why may this be? Well, research shows that greater slow wave sleep indicates higher sleep need. Therefore, these results signify that greater remaining sleep need is associated with decreased improvement on the high load cognitive task. This is important because it shows that sleep debt may remain even after multiple days of sleep extension, and the sleep debt could have a negative impact on cognitive performance. So perhaps those who are already severely sleep deprived will take longer to recover, and they may not see improvements in cognitive function unless they extend their sleep over multiple days and perhaps weeks. Okay, let's also look at the results after sleep deprivation. Here's the difference in test scores after sleep deprivation compared to baseline. As you can see, performance for low and high cognitive load tasks decreased after sleep deprivation. However, there was a significantly greater reduction in performance in the high cognitive load test, which displayed negative or fearful versus neutral faces. I knew those faces would have an impact somehow. But why is this? Well, prior research has found that sleep deprivation disrupts activity in the amygdala, which is responsible for the stress response. And this increases likelihood of sudden and uncontrollable emotional responses. These emotional responses to fear-inducing faces, for instance, can have an impact on cognitive processing. Thus, when the sleep-deprived participants saw the scary faces, they were likely more distracted by their emotional response, and this caused them to choose the wrong answer more often. Finally, the researchers analyzed how total sleep time and percentage of slow wave sleep during the recovery phase were associated with performance on the cognitive task after sleep deprivation. What they found was that greater total sleep time and slow wave sleep during recovery were associated with lower scores on the cognitive task. So, to restate in another way, the more sleep deprived a participant was, the worse they performed on the cognitive task. Okay, I think most of us know that already, but it's a good sanity check to make sure the findings of this research actually make sense. So, how does this research fit into the current guidelines set in the US? While the CDC recommends adults sleep between 7 to 9 hours per night, the study agrees with that recommendation and shows that sleeping closer to 9 hours may yield boosts for cognitive performance. While these findings are exciting, it's important to remember that everyone's different, and what works well for some may not work as well for others. Nevertheless, I generally feel much better when I get plenty of sleep, and so I'm going to continue aiming for 9 hours of sleep per night. If you are someone who's been sleeping less, why not give sleep extension a try for a week and just see how you feel? I mean, what's the worst that could happen? You spend a little extra time laying comfortably in bed? Doesn't sound too bad to me. Anyway, thanks for watching, and if you found this video useful, please give it a like and subscribe for more content. Also, please feel free to leave a comment. Maybe you can tell us if sleep extension did or did not work for you, or you could provide input for future videos you'd like to see. I really appreciate your participation, as it will ensure that the content I make moving forward has a positive impact. All right, everyone. Until next time, stay healthy.